I hope my screen is visible. Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. The first presentation for the day will be on the topic estimation of market and non-market agricultural production and will be presented by me. Also for context, this is one of the topics that the Tuvalu Statistics Department had requested for assistance on, and this presentation has also been put together with that perspective in mind. So we look forward to any comments, feedback, and suggestions you may have regarding that. So before really getting into agriculture, let's recapitulate our basics on market and non-market production. And production, as we know, is subdivided between market production, production for own final use, and non-market production. Market output is basically the normal situation that we know. That is in a market where the producer is making decisions about how much to produce and what to produce. That's based on the expected levels of demand and the expected costs of supply. The determining factor behind this decision will be the economically significant prices. That is, the prices at which a buyer is willing to buy the product and the seller is willing to sell the product. The non-market output, on the other hand, is related to specific output and production that is undertaken by the general government and NPISHs that takes place in the absence of economically significant prices. And then we have production for own use, which we'll be getting to a couple of slides later. But first, just illustrating the features of market output. So what's necessary to demarcate a product as market output is that it needs to be disposed of in the market or intended for disposal in the market, which could either be through sale or barter. And some of the features that help that this distinction is that, like I mentioned, it should be sold at economically significant prices. It could be bartered. It could be used for payment in kind. It could be supplied by one production unit of a company to another, which could be for their intermediate or final use, or it could be added to the inventories of finished goods and work in progress. Non-market output, on the other hand, like I mentioned, it could be an individual or collective service that's provided specifically by non-profit institutions serving households or governments, and these are supplied free or maybe at prices that are not economically significant to other institutional units or community as a whole. So, which means that they could be highly subsidized or just supplied free of cost. And what is necessary is that this not be confused with the production for own use. So production for own use, that is when a producer is consuming whatever item of production that they are into. That's called production for own use and is not counted as non-market production. So to illustrate this a little bit more, let's distinguish activities in human activities in three broad categories. So any activity that is related to the physiological, education, recreational activities, they're called personal activities and are non-economic in nature. The second category is recorded economic activities. That is the activities that are economic in nature and they're also recorded. So there's an account of these activities that we have, and these are considered within the production boundary, and therefore we can call them SNA activities. Then there's a third category, which are economic activities that go unrecorded, or they are non-observed or not visible. And these could include goods and services produced and consumed by households. And by that logic, one could conclude that these could be non-SNA activities, but are they really is the question that we will try to answer. So let's look at the production decision tree. So starting with, so whenever thinking about distinguishing any output as market or non-market output, the first question we begin is to ask whether capital, labor, or material inputs were used to produce this good or services. If, for example, the answer to that is no, which could be in the case of resources like oil, fish, natural forest, then these are naturally excluded from the production boundary and GDP. However, if capital, labor, and other inputs did go into production, then we ask a second question as to whether that particular item was exchanged for cash or as barter. If it was, then the decision is clear that does become a part of the production boundary. But if not, then the next question to ask is whether it was a good. That is, it may not be exchanged for cash or a barter, but if it was produced and it was good, then again it becomes a part of the production boundary. However, if it is not a good, then the natural question to ask is if it was a non market service that the government or households serving sorry, that was provided by government or housing services provided by owner occupiers. If the answer is yes, then again it's a part of the production boundary. But if no, then it could be, let's say, an activity like cooking, childcare, laundry, taking care of the house, etc. And these activities are also excluded from the production boundary at the moment. So this is to say that if a good is used for one's own final use, that does become a part of the production boundary. But in the case of services, we at the moment only include services that were provided by the government, or if it was a service that was if it was the housing service in the case of an owner occupying their own building and not living on a rental accommodation. So, to sum this, if you look at the production boundary, all the goods that are produced within households, even if they were for final consumption, they are included in the production boundary. And if they were non-marketed, for example, then because they were used for their own use, it's necessary to evaluate them at the equivalent market price. And this would include the following categories of items that you can see on my screen. But the ones that I'm going to highlight for the specific discussion today are the ones that are related to agriculture. So, two of these categories, agricultural produce and the subsequent storage, gathering of uncultivated crops for own consumption, wood cutting, collection of firewood, hunting, and fishing, as well as the processing of agricultural products and production of dairy. All of this becomes part of the production boundary, even though they might be produced in a way that a producer is producing and consuming them on their own. So now, given all this context, it becomes relatively clear as to what we mean technically when we refer to output for final use. So it consists of products that a producer retains for their own final use, or it could be for capital formation. And in order to value this output for final use, we determine it as a sum of the following. It would include the value of all goods that are produced by unincorporated enterprise and they're consumed by the same household. It will also include the value of services that are provided to the households by paid domestic staff. That also is a part of this category. Then we include the value of imputed services of owner occupied dwellings, as I mentioned previously. Adding to it is the value of the fixed assets that are produced by an establishment that they retain for their future production. So, for example, if there's an enterprise that manufactures heavy machinery, if they are also retaining that machinery for further production in their own unit, then that becomes part of this category. And finally, any value of change in inventory of finished goods and work in progress is also a part of the output for own final use. Now, talking about the valuation of this output, which is critical as we would further talk about agriculture as a sector, it's necessary that we keep in mind the following fundamentals. Starting with valuing this output at basic prices at which the goods and services could be sold if they were sold on the market. And in order to value them in this way, it's important that the goods or services of the same kind must actually be sold in sufficient quantities on the market to enable reliable market prices. So, for example, if there's an item that is generally not bought and sold in sufficient quantities that one could determine their market output, then that valuation could be tricky. So it's important that these are items that are actually bought and sold in the market. And when we're referring to on the market, we are basically meaning that the price that would prevail between a willing buyer and a willing seller at the time and place that such a good and services are produced. So to bring all of this together, this chart is really helpful. For here, we look at the different types of producers as well as the different categories of output that they may produce. So this is also to say that if there's a market producer, it's not that their entire product would output would entirely be market output. They could also be producing some output for their own final use or some non-market, which is not generally the case. But yeah, the idea is that the type of output may also differ. So yeah, so we have three categories of producers: market producers, which include establishments in large corporations, as well as small unincorporated enterprise, but most of their products need to be marketed. The second category is producers for own final use, which includes all household unincorporated enterprises now, and this would include subsistence farmers, since they're mostly producing food that they are consuming on their own, and households engaged in the construction of their own dwellings. Again, this is typical of some of the economies where people construct their own dwellings. And the third category is basically other non-market producers, which includes the general government and non-profit institutions serving households, as we have discussed. A market producer would mostly be producing market output, but they could also be producing some level of output for their own final use. Examples are some that we have discussed: own account capital formation, own account software, research and development, etc. But they would not be producing any non-market output. In the case of producers for own final use, they could be also producing some level of market output. For example, a farmer could be mostly into subsistence farming, but they could also be selling some of their grains and vegetables outside in the market. But mostly it's going to be output for own final use in this category, and none in the category of non-market output. In the third category of basically the general government and NPISH, here they could also be producing some market output. For example, if they are asking for a fees for a particular government service, or if they are selling off a government publication, that is generally market output. And they could also be producing some level of output for their own final use. That is, if they're creating their own fixed assets or own capital formation. But most of their output lies in the third category, that is other non-market output, which are, as you mentioned, any free service of education, electricity, etc., that the government is providing. So with this broad matrix structure in mind, we can now talk about agriculture and where that fits in. And here it's also important to talk a little bit about subsistence agriculture, since that is still a very common phenomenon in most of the developing economies. And of course, subsistence agriculture, as we know, is when um, most of the product of the agricultural production is used entirely by those responsible for the production, and it becomes a significant part of household consumption, and by that extension of GDP also. So in countries where much of the staple food is grown for own consumption and it is seasonal, it is necessary to consider whether some of the increase in the value of the crop is due to the storage or part of production, which we'll be getting into later. But what's necessary for us to kind of highlight at the start of this presentation, as we later on get into the estimation methods, is that subsistence agriculture is usually excluded from the scope of informal sector services, even though by nature it may be taken as informal economy. This is so because not only because they tend to exclude agriculture, that is such informal sector surveys, but also because they exclude enterprises that are solely involved in non-market activities. So again, in terms of to understand subsistence agriculture, it's necessary that we separately consider two different situations. The first situation is usually when farmers keep and store a part of their production and then they sell the rest. But there's also a second situation where a farmer may sell their entire crop at the time of the harvest, and then they have to buy small quantities again as and when needed for their own consumption. Now, the part for the own consumption is usually estimated in national accounts by use of appropriate ratios. That is, it's assumed that a certain ratio of the production would be of subsistence in nature, and production as a whole is then obtained from agricultural production services, which are based on measurement of areas and yields by major crop, which we'll be talking about in the methods when we come to that. And the respective shares of commercialized and stored production are then obtained from income and expenditure surveys. So production is basically calculated as a whole, and appropriate ratios are used from agriculture or income expenditure surveys to determine which part is market production and which one is subsistence in nature. So, when we refer to agricultural output, let's go by the ISIC revision 4 definition of it, which is basically inclusive of agriculture, forestry, and fishing. So, like we know, as per the classification, there are the three major categories, which are crop and animal production, hunting, and related services. Second is forestry and logging, and the third is fishing and aquaculture. We'd be looking separately into how the output for each of these categories is generally recommended to be estimated. So the so yeah, starting with the first category, which is the crop output. It's necessary to put down some fundamentals here again. The first one being that the focus should be on physical quantity and not sales. Again, for agriculture, we would focus on estimating the quantity first. And this quantity is measured by regions and multiplied by the average regional price per physical unit at the farm gate. So essentially the thing to highlight here is that it is measured by region, and a specific average regional price is used, since both the production and price may vary per region. Uh, Another thing to keep in mind is that the method that is used for agriculture, it should not be dependent on sales, as is usually applied to sectors like manufacturing and services, because a significant part of the crop and other output is not for sale, but for own final consumption. So if we are only accounting for sales, we are not including the part that was for own consumption, as we have mentioned before. So the takeaway here being emphasis is on physical quantity and not sales. The second thing to keep in mind is the use of farm gate prices. So, though output for final use should be valued at basic prices at which the goods and services are offered in the market, it is not exactly applicable exactly to agricultural output, because in the case of agriculture, these prices do not necessarily equate the prices in the local market, because even for delivery in the local market, your transportation cost and possibly wholesale margins may be included. Therefore, it is recommended that a nearest equivalent price, which is called the farm gate price, because we assume it's the price that the grower could receive by selling the produce to any purchaser who came to the farm directly to collect the produce. And therefore, it's recommended that we use farm gate prices. So moving on to the methodology that is used for estimating crop output. Another sort of side point here is that these recommendations are made by the African Development Bank and are methods that are already used in developing economies in Africa. And these recommendations are coming from there. So again, estimating crop output would mean we focus on physical quantity calculation and prices calculation. For physical quantity, the general rule is that we multiply land area which is devoted to agriculture, and we multiply it by the annual yield rate. So we need two things here. When we talk of yield rate, these will be collected seasonally and by crop cuts, because yield rates may differ by crop and that may differ by season. The second data point here that's needed is basically the land use, how much land was under that the cover of that particular crop, and this is measured in 5-year agricultural censuses, either by counting every agricultural household, or with the coming up of advanced techniques like aerial digital imagery of land from satellite, etc. That's also another cutting edge method to measure land use. So yeah, so obtaining these data points of yield rate and land use will then let us know of the physical quantity that was produced. And the second piece of information here that's relevant is the prices. And as mentioned, the gross output of a crop in terms of value is then measured by multiplying the quantity with the average price at the farm gate. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here are that the average price is normally a weighted average price, and that's prepared for each type of crop separately. And these weights may reflect basically the share of that particular type of crop in the same region. The prices at the farm gates are basically equivalent to a basic price, and therefore they will not be inclusive of any product tax, trade margin, transport cost, etc. And it's assumed that that will be invoiced separately to the purchaser by the farmer. Okay, so generally, what happens is that a benchmark, when looking at the estimating the crop output, a benchmark or census value is usually calculated in a particular year, and that's done by again the formulas that we mentioned. Quantity is determined by land area and benchmark yield, and then we get the output by multiplying the quantity with the farm gate prices. The common practice is that regular 5-year censuses of agriculture are conducted to collect data on agricultural land use. And the physical outputs of major crops such as rice, wheat, etc., are then individually estimated by land area in use, and they are individually multiplied by the specific yield rate. What happens between the census years is that only the yield rate will be revised, and the land use is generally assumed to have been constant during that intermittent period. However, when a drastic change in national conditions may happen, and it is assumed that something may have altered the land use patterns in general, then one needs to update the land area in use. Then, once the benchmark and census values are calculated, we look at the annual and quarterly calculations in the post-census years, which is done at the current prices and the constant prices at current prices. It's basically done by using the updated land area and current yield rate and current farm gate prices. In the case of constant prices, however, it is done by multiplying quantity output with the benchmark prices. Or the other way of doing it is that we deflate the output at current prices using appropriate price indices. Similar to that, intermediate consumption, such as seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, fuel, normal maintenance, repairs of fixed assets, etc., is calculated per unit of land for the census here. I'd like to kind of highlight here that it may be there may be a scenario where getting these coefficients per unit of land may not be possible, and they may be available for per unit of quantity of output. However, it is recommended that we prefer the former, that is by per unit of land, as it better reflects investment decisions. This is because the input that is required per unit of land this is because input is required per unit of land, while output depends not only on inputs but also on weather and other factors, etc. In the case, so this is true of a benchmark year or a census survey year. However, in the post census year, the IC may be calculated at constant prices by using benchmark coefficients and estimating IC at constant prices. For current prices, the benchmark coefficients, cost coefficients are brought to current prices using appropriate indices. And the next step is pretty straightforward for both benchmark and annual and quarterly estimations, wherein the value added is now derived by subtracting the intermediate consumption from the output. It may also be worth just briefly mentioning the commodity flow method here, which is basically a commodity flow equation for measuring agricultural production, which you also see on my screen here. So the equation goes as output and import of agricultural production being equal to all the inputs to production of other goods, and then final consumption by households, the change in inventory of agricultural output, as well as any exports of agriculture. So, an equation or a method like this really helps to reconcile the use and supply of a given agricultural product that comes from different sources. That is, it could be from a survey of production or a household survey on expenditures, or even a source such as a foreign trade statistics data set, etc. So for products, so for basically like data points coming from different sources, a method like this helps to reconcile the use and supply. Therefore, even for some products which cannot be directly surveyed, output may be indirectly derived using a method such as this. So the method that we talked up till now, wherein the focus was on determining quantity based on land use and yield rate, a method like that would implicitly account for subsistence agriculture, because the idea there is focusing on how much crop was grown or produced. However, there could be situations wherein a particular stats department may not be following that approach, or they might be using highest, or there may be a need to calculate the own account consumption separately. And for purposes like this, one way of doing that could be using the household income and expenditure services. So again, in the benchmark year, the data is collected using the highs, and then the current year estimates are obtained by extrapolating the base year per capita consumption using an index of rural population growth. So it's generally assumed that the per capita consumption would have been largely constant, but uh, the index of population growth is used for revising the estimates. So again, some of the key things to key concepts basically to keep in mind is that focusing on consumption per head is important. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's usually assumed that for subsistence consumption, the per head consumption of farm population would have remained fairly constant. However, there may be change in patterns, and therefore, I'll mention a couple of considerations that one can look at the data at a more macro level to see if that's realistic. So we'll highlight two trends here. One is that when a country, if in a country the population is growing fairly rapidly, then the trend that we see is that the average age of the population will be generally falling. And therefore, in the short term, the food consumption on a per head basis, including consumption for own production, that can be expected to fall as well. So that's basically like an inverse relationship between population and consumption per head. And in countries where the household income levels are rising in general, then it can be assumed that subsistence becomes relatively less important, as is also something that we have seen. And therefore, there is this relationship wherein if we are seeing that a country is rising on the household income levels, then the consumption per head may be adjusted likewise. Um, yeah, crop prices for own final consumption. Here, it's important that we keep in that mind that the uh, what happens is that in most countries, the major part of each crop is harvested over a relatively short period and also in very well defined areas. So this is not something that may be like constant, like throughout the geography of the country. So it's important to keep in mind the defined area as well as the timing of the crop prices. And therefore, in such cases, the national average price can only be satisfactorily calculated as a simple average of producer prices in the main growing areas and also in the peak harvesting season. So that should be kept in mind when looking at the crop prices for calculating own final consumption and subsistence agriculture. Another key feature of subsistence agriculture in developing countries is the storage of subsistence crops, which is very important. And for the most part, storage activities are either excluded completely from the national accounts or they may only be covered accidentally, that is, if they are implicitly a part of the storage cost. So it is generally better to use harvest time prices for valuing crop output and also to make separate explicit estimate for the gross output and the value added of crop storage. The gross output of storage activities is basically nothing but the difference in the value of the subsistence crops on removal of from the store for consumption and from their value on entering the store at harvest time. So the difference between those two uh, outputs at producer prices is basically the value of the crop storage. The gross output also consists of intermediate consumption like pesticides, repairs, maintenance cost, fumigation, etc., and value added, and mainly which is mainly labor cost and depreciation of storage buildings. Another key feature here is agriculture services, and these are of various types and normally required for each type of crop, livestock, fishing, and forestry separately. These could include, again, pest, disease control, grading, packaging, etc. In the census year, the recommendation made by the African Development Manual is that they should be fully covered in the census or survey. And for every annual or quarterly estimate after that year, it should be extrapolated using the benchmark coefficients that were derived during the census year. Then there's also the concept of supplementary agricultural output. So for byproducts of most crops, so every crop may have a byproduct which may have its own final use, or it could also serve as an intermediate use, such as rice straws, which are generally used as a source of energy, or other products that are grown in the backyard for sale, such as fruits, vegetables, etc. So they're supplementary to the main crop, but they could have a use of their own. And for such byproducts, these estimates may be obtained for at least the major crops as a percentage of those crops. Backyard supplementary production is obtained through household surveys, and this may be calculated in terms of per capita consumption. And preferably, it should be separate for the rural and urban households, since there may be very different consumption patterns in the two contexts. If such a product is seasonal, then the annual per capita consumption can be estimated by multiplying the per capita consumption per week with the number of weeks during which it is available. The recommendation here is that the special efforts should be devoted to collecting these supplementary agricultural products. And depending on the country context, they could be very important, at least for the benchmark here. So that was basically crop output till now. Moving on to the next category under agriculture, which is forestry, logging, and related products. So this category, as we know, includes planting and harvesting of trees and woods, the production of charcoal, distillation of wood, etc., etc. And the intermediate consumption here is estimated by the same method that is applied to crops. Then there's also forestry services, which are forestry management, firefighting, protection, pest control, etc. And these must also be estimated using the benchmark ratios of the census year. For fishing and aquaculture, the recommendation is to use the same method as that is applied to a crop. For this, the data that is required is the yield per unit of water covered area. So again, the yield per unit of water will be multiplied by the total area of water in which aquaculture is being performed. Then multiplying the two will give the physical quantity of fishing. If it is at sea, if this fishing is happening at sea, then the recommendation is that it should definitely be surveyed. And what is usually seen as in the category, in the case of fishing and aquaculture, quantities are normally provided by the specialized agencies themselves who are responsible for this measurement. And then to gain output is then estimated by multiplying quantity and average unit price as equivalent to what we did for the crops. Usually, a supplementary survey may also be needed to estimate the intermediate consumption coefficients for the census year. And then using those coefficients, we can estimate the IC and the value added. Then comes the livestock output, which is slightly a different category. And the way to go about estimating livestock output is to first estimate it in terms of the number and weight. And then that is the valuation is done at basic prices, essentially. So there are basically two types of animals when we look at livestock. They could be fixed assets, that is dairy animals, for that they are helping us produce dairy products, or it could be sheep, etc., that are being raised for their wool, and therefore considered as fixed asset. The next category is a work in progress category, which would include animals that are reared for slaughter, or they could also include young animals, which that is animals that are less than 1 year and would later on be treated as fixed assets. The formula that is generally used for livestock output is also it's up on the screen. That is output of live animals and imports should equal the animals slaughtered in that year, the exports in that year, and the change in animal stock. Now, data on these animals slaughtered, this is obtained from expert assumptions based on the annual death and birth rates of livestock, and they form the basis of the estimation of changes in animal stock as well. If there was a situation that a huge number of animals died because of natural causes, or like any number of animals for that matter, then they are not counted as an output. Some other considerations which are very specific to livestock category are as following. The first one being that a special but small scale survey, which will be similar to an agricultural product survey, is needed to collect data on IC, at least for the benchmark year. Uh, then fixed ratios for estimating growth rate and slaughtering. Uh, the problem with them is that they may reflect long-term trends quite well, but they tend to ignore short-term variations, which may be very substantial sometimes. For example, if there was some disease that's on the go, etc. So, like I mentioned, diseases can cause sharp annual fluctuations in the numbers of poultry and small livestock. And in bad harvest years, farmers then try hard to maintain their level of cash by selling more cattle for slaughter. So, therefore, in the subsequent years, the takeoff rate may fall because then the farmers are trying to replenish their herds. So, this is basically one pattern that should be considered when making this estimation. Also, few countries have accurate data on short-term variations of this sort, but it is possible to make rough adjustments to production and takeoff rates for year-to-year changes on the basis of partial information on licensed slaughtering, or using the data on meat, cattle, or trades in hides and skins, etc. So, given all of this brief background on estimation methods for the four categories, there are also things that we can keep in mind for checking the consistency of basic data in all of these four categories. For example, for agricultural output, the recommendation is that the estimates of crop consumption must be consistent with whatever information is available on crop production, and they must also imply a realistic diet in terms of protein and calorie intake. In the case of livestock, the data from annual livestock censuses must be credible and validated with what we know about reproduction and takeoff rates. And often estimates of number of animals slaughtered can be checked against data on hides and skins and assumptions about reproduction, milk yields, egg production, and so forth. So, on the basis of other corollary data, one can validate the data from the animal livestock censuses. In the case of fishing, data on fishing production can be checked against estimates of the total number of boats or, say, nets in use. So these are again data points that can be used to triangulate the information we already have from our surveys and admin data. In the case of hunting, official statistics can be partly verified by using data on import of hunting cartridges or licenses or trade in hunting trophies, etc. So these are basically some useful ways of checking the consistency of the basic data that we are collecting in order to make our estimation and making sure that they are in line with other trends and other pieces of information from other sources. Then there are some other things that one should make make a note of while making agricultural estimations, as are mentioned in the SNA, and those are the following. The first one being the measurement of agricultural output, forestry, and fishing is complicated by the fact that this production may extend over many months or even years. So that needs to be kept in mind. And it's more true of agricultural crops than anything else because many of the crops are annual in nature, and therefore most costs occur when at the beginning of the season when the crop is sowed, or it may be at the end of the season when it is harvested. However, immature crops have a value depending on their closeness to harvest, and therefore the value of these crops must be spread over the year, and they should be treated as work in progress. Often, the final value of the output will differ from the estimate that is made and imputed. In such cases, revisions should be made to the early estimates to reflect the actual output. When the crop is harvested, the cumulated value of work in progress is then converted to inventories of finished goods. And then that inventory is then run down as it is used by the producer, or it may be sold, or may be lost due to other reasons, etc. Then it's also important to keep in mind that some plants and animals take very many years to reach maturity. And in cases like this, the increase in their value is shown as output from one year to the other. And it's also and treated as increases in fixed capital or inventories, depending on whether the plant or animal yields repeat products or not. So in the case that it does yield repeat products, it's made a part of fixed capital. The value of the increase in the plant or animal should also take into account of the delay before the yield from them is realized. And once a plant or animal has reached maturity, it will decline in value. And we also need to record this decline in value as consumption of fixed capital. Now, in countries where much of the staple food is grown for own consumption and that it is seasonal, it is necessary to consider whether some part of the increase in the value of the crop due to storage is part of production. So, storage also becomes an important angle to consider, basically. I'll quickly take us through this example of measurement of agricultural output in the Australian system of national accounts, taken on from some of the concepts that we've already talked about. So, what's interesting about Australia stat is that they're using a bunch of resources, bunch of data sources when calculating agriculture. So they're conducting an agricultural census every 5 years. They're taking the market prices and costs from two separate annual surveys that they are collecting. And the market prices are usually in combination with the quantities that are collecting from the agricultural survey. They're also collecting economic and financial data on agricultural and services uh, through their annual economic activity survey. So, in addition to these surveys, there's also a quarterly livestock product survey. So, they are basically collecting livestock information every quarter. And in addition to that, they are collecting quarterly production quantities from marketing authorities also. The way that they are basically estimating their product, and I'll just walk us through very quickly for the past couple of slides to just give a basic idea of the estimation methods that Australia is following, which may be useful for some of the countries in the Pacific to know. And it's that in the case of cereals and non-cereal crops, the quarterly estimates they're usually obtaining from the farmers themselves. For annual estimates, the data on annual production is collected from agricultural services or their census. Quantity data is then revalued to current prices using the market prices survey. In the case of livestock, again, like I mentioned, they have a quarterly livestock survey. So their slaughterings uh, data and live exports data is estimated directly from that survey. And the estimate for capitalized and work in progress livestock is done by allocating the annual estimate across the four quarters. So in this category, the annual estimate is collected first. In the case of annual estimates, again, the data sources remain pretty much the same. What they're really doing is that they're taking their quarterly source data and then they're annualizing it, which is true for slaughterings, live export, um, even disposal quantities and work in progress. In the case of livestock products, they're basically breaking it down to four key products, which is wool, milk, egg, and honey. And their their source for quarterly data on these categories is coming from, in the case of wool, it's coming from quarterly livestock products, as is in the case of milk. In the case of egg, however, they're spreading the annual production across the quarters and not vice versa. For honey, again, they're using historical quarterly ratios. For annual estimates, like I mentioned, for wool and milk, they took the quarterly estimates first and then they're analyzing it. For egg, they're directly using the agricultural census, and same is the case for honey. However, here they're basically using an older census data and older historical ratios. Now, after giving a brief overview of Australia, there was also this very interesting paper that did a multi-country study on how various economies are calculating the output of their non-observed economy. And we've been able to compile their approach specific to agriculture and own final consumption in agriculture and basically put down this table here. The interesting thing here being is that various countries have been using various approaches here, which is which gives us a snapshot of uh, the implementation of all that we have already discussed today in the presentation. For example, in the case of Azerbaijan, it's seen that they are calculating informal production based on a special survey of farmer households, and they are also using administrative sources. Belgian, on the other hand, they are calculating a value added for all of the branches by using, so they are using a like an overall estimation method, and they are using detailed quantity and price output that's coming from the center of the agricultural economy. So it's coming from basically a government department or a board there. In Bulgaria, all agricultural producers, which includes private households also, they are required to be under a special additional register that's created by the Register of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. Czech Republic, we see that they are using household budget data for specifically having estimates on own account output of agriculture. And for farm, basically they're using other forestry statistics and export estimates for other categories. In the case of Germany, they are using an implicit coverage method. That is, they're basically calculating the yield and the land and then multiplying the two to get the output. Ireland's method was a little bit different. They are using a method of estimating using an output based approach. Here, sales of the principal agricultural products are calculated from the demand side, so they're independent of any information that a farmer may provide. So, generally, what they're using is again budget surveys and national farm surveys that's coming from household consumption patterns. In the case of Kazakhstan, their output in agriculture is determined, and that implicitly includes the estimates of the non observed economy too. And because they are again based on collecting data on the area and the type and the yield. For Kyrgyzstan, they are using a farm survey of farmer households and private subsidiary plots separately. So they are doing like a specialized survey here. So yeah, sorry. So yeah, that's with the reference to other countries and the techniques that they have been using. That's all that I had to present on the set topic. And yeah, in case of any questions, kindly feel free to answer now or later after the second presentation. Um, okay, in case there are questions, maybe we can then take them towards the end, and I can now hand it over to Faith for her presentation. Um,
Thanks, Sam. I think there's a technical issue in Faith's Teams application. So we'll we'll try to schedule her topic in the coming weeks instead. So we have maybe a couple more minutes to entertain questions for Sam.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, we can have questions. Okay, Jessica, I think we may not have questions at the moment. So, yeah, I'd request for any comments, suggestions that anyone may have. Please feel free to send them over to me later, or if there's anything that you'd like to discuss in particular, I'd be open to it. But yeah, thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Sam. We'll cut short the SNA session today, and we'll have the IO session again next in 2 weeks. Thank you, everyone.